This video is about updating 2D land geometry from observers reports using spreadsheets and SUGEOMCSV. It contains examples using a split spread layout with a 2-channel gap. It also includes images of spreadsheets for various 2D geometry situations. As well, there is a section that recommends using the standard SPS2 files for these 2D surveys. And finally, there is a section which discusses 2D CDP numbering using SUBIN-CSV.
I'm going to show how to use 3 spreadsheet tables to define 2D survey geometry. I'm going to start with the easiest table and proceed to the hardest table, even though the tables are actually used in the opposite order. For simple 2D surveys, you may not have any actual surveyed coordinates, just information which tells you the spacing between points. Field information may refer to this as point spacing, receiver spacing, or station spacing. Typically, you also have elevation values. Now you can create rows in a spreadsheet with point numbers and x-coordinates incrementing by the spacing. The y-coordinate is all zeros. Then add your elevations at their proper location. The first column should contain the letter R. You should create similar rows in another spreadsheet, except that the first column is S. Before creating the third spreadsheet table, we are going to define an example. If the observer's reports and field information says they are recording 24 traces in a split spread layout with a 2-point gap, then the situation is like this. For a normal shot, we are recording 12 receivers, then there are 2 receivers that are not recording, then another 12 receivers that are recording. For a normal shot in the middle of the line, the observer's report will tell you which point number the shot is near and which receiver points are being recorded. Typically, this is done by specifying which point the first channel is on and which point the channel on the other side of the gap is on. Now you need to describe this shot in a spreadsheet table. Since this is a split spread layout, it will have 2 X records in this table. Each record will describe one segment of receivers being recorded. The columns of this table contain the values described here. This image shows the shot point number and the receiver point ranges of the 2 segments. Channels 1 to 12 are on receiver points 111 to 122, and channels 13 to 24 are on receiver point numbers 125 to 136. For normal shots in the middle of the line, you can expect the shot point numbers to change by some standard increment such as 2 or 4. From one shot to the next, the receiver point ranges usually also change by that standard increment, but the channel ranges usually stay the same. Once all 3 spreadsheet tables fully describe the acquisition, updating the trace headers with geometry is straightforward. First, output CSV files from the 3 spreadsheets. The setup parameters for SUGEOMCSV to update trace headers from those CSV files are shown here. Note that the setup for the CSV file containing the X records must be used first. This diagram indicates how SUGEOMCSV updates values to trace headers. First, the field record number and the field channel number from the input trace headers are used to find the correct X record. The shot point number from the X record is updated to the output trace headers. The receiver point number of the input field channel number is computed from the channel range and receiver range of that segment and also updated to the output trace header. A second SUGEOMCSV then uses the shot point number to find the correct S record, and the values from that S record are updated to the trace headers. A third SUGEOMCSV then uses the receiver point number to find the correct R record, and the values from that R record are updated to the trace headers. Until now, the shot points and receiver points could be thought of as the same points, but after this, it is better to think of them as existing on two different lines that are near each other. Quite often, 2D surveys have shots which are located halfway between receivers. This is often called half-station shooting. One way to deal with half-station shooting is to move the shot point locations. So, if you put the receiver points at 50-meter increments on the x-coordinate, just add 25 meters to all the shot point x-coordinates. Often, shot offsets exist as well. These can be dealt with simply by adding the offset to either the x-coordinate or the y-coordinate. Here is an example where spreadsheet functionality comes in handy. If you have been given receiver coordinates and also told that shots are halfway between receivers, it is easy to compute coordinates for the halfway location. Just average the previous receiver coordinates with the next receiver coordinates using the formula shown here. That formula is good for every point except the last one. But the last one can be extrapolated using another formula shown here. Sometimes you will also get shot offsets and coordinates, and therefore you have to take the local angle into consideration. Similarly, sometimes a 2D line will have some bends in it. To get coordinates for a bending line requires piecewise linear interpolation. There does not appear to be piecewise linear interpolation functions available within common spreadsheet programs, so you may have to deal with bends using your own computations. We are going to take a wider view for the next situations. Here we see a typical shot in the middle of a line. But at the beginning of the line, we might need to create these X records. This corresponds to a situation where a split spread with a 2-point gap has been laid out and does not change as initial shots are acquired. That is, channels 1 to 12 stay at receiver points 101 to 112, and channels 13 to 24 stay at receiver points 115 to 126. So, only the red dot for the shot location would move in this diagram. Or, the acquisition could choose to move the 2-point gap with the shot. This means there could be a small number of channels and receivers being recorded on one side of the gap, and a larger number of channels and receivers being recorded on the other side of the gap. Or, the acquisition could choose to move the 2-point gap with the shot, but just throw away channels before the beginning of the line. Sometimes it is convenient for acquisition to simply pretend that there are more receiver points than actually exist. This keeps the observer's report simpler, or perhaps hardware limitations require full channel recording. Shots in the middle of lines can also be similar to shots at the beginning or ending of lines. This is often done when obstructions prevent putting shots where they were planned or intended. Those missing shots are then made up with other shots. This may cause confusion when observers refer to those shots by the point number they were intended to have. This is the same setup shown earlier, but showing the X file. Same setup as earlier, but showing the S file. Same setup as earlier, but showing the R file. Previously, I showed the minimum reasonable spreadsheets needed for 2D geometry. But it would probably be better for you in the long run if you use the same spreadsheets as for SPS2 files. SPS2 files are standard, and therefore various programs can use them for plots, displays, and so on. And clients may want them even if you have just created them from old observers reports and field notes. To use an SPS2X file for 2D, just set all the shot line numbers and receiver line numbers to the same number. These line numbers exist in two places on the SPS2X records, so you will see them in two columns in a spreadsheet created for X records. Set the shot line numbers for the spreadsheet for the S records also. Note that there are columns here for more values than the simple 2D example which we created previously. Just set those values reasonably if you do not have explicit numbers for them. And set the receiver line numbers for the spreadsheet for the R records. Now, you may notice that the match option SPS2 uses the line number and the point number to match values in the S records and R records. That is okay here because we have set the line numbers to a constant. So the match will effectively just be the point number like the setup for our simpler spreadsheets. After updating the geometry, you will want to set the CDP numbers in the traces. There are two methods available in SUGEOMCSV. The second method is to define a 3D grid. You can define a grid that only has one cell in the cross-line direction. If you do this, and your line has actual surveyed coordinates, make sure the one cell is quite wide. But if your survey does have actual surveyed coordinates, I do not recommend using a grid definition. Instead, I recommend you use the SUGEOMCSV option to compute CDP numbers from point numbers. To see why I do not recommend a grid for 2D, here is an image of some trace midpoints in cells at the start of a grid. Notice that I have put the midpoint locations into clumps. This occurs because the surveyors are, of course, trying to place the shot and receiver coordinates in nearly a straight line. This image shows cells further along inside the grid. Notice the trouble that is occurring. Some cell boundaries are splitting clumps. Worse, one cell has no midpoints in it at all. You might be able to shift the grid so that these problems do not occur, but the longer your 2D line, the less likely you will succeed. The problem comes down to the fact that in one part of your line, the clumps may be separated by slightly less than the cell width, and in another part of your line, the clumps may be separated by slightly more than the cell width. So you get either a nearly empty cell or a nearly double fold cell, no matter how you shift. This image shows the parameters and computation for CDP numbers from point numbers. Note that for half-station shooting, the shot computation should typically be adjusted by 1 CDP.